Chapter 1. The Arrival. The road stretched for miles through the barren landscape, flanked by towering crops of wheat that whispered in the wind. A lone car wound its way down the narrow path, kicking up dust in its wake. Inside, Nathan sat, hands gripping the steering wheel as his eyes traced the winding road ahead. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows over the endless fields. He had come here on a simple errand, a visit to the isolated farm he'd inherited after his uncle's sudden passing. A legacy that had been tucked away in the family, unknown to him until the will arrived at his door. The farm was distant, shrouded in a fog of mystery and the quiet hush of secrecy. But now, it belonged to him. The air outside grew colder, the warmth of the sun slipping away as night began to creep over the horizon. The fields on either side of the road seemed to sway in a rhythmic, eerie pattern, moving in tune with the wind but feeling somehow deliberate, as though something unseen was guiding them. The farmhouse soon came into view, a weathered structure sitting alone amidst the sea of golden wheat. The building was old, its walls darkened with age and neglect, the roof sagging slightly. A solitary barn stood off to the side, its large doors hanging half open, revealing only shadows inside. There was no sound but the soft rustle of the crops. Nathan parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he walked toward the house. A sense of unease began to creep into his mind, though there was no obvious reason for it. It was just a farm, just an old house. His footsteps grew slower as he reached the porch, noticing the warped wood and chipped paint. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry, though the house was supposed to have been empty for years. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. The interior was dimly lit, the last rays of sunlight slipping through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the room. Old furniture stood in disarray. Tables, chairs, all seemingly untouched for ages. Nathan's eyes were drawn to a large painting hanging on the wall, a portrait of his uncle, stern and unyielding, staring out as if watching over the house even after death. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive stillness that seemed to cling to every surface. He moved through the room slowly, inspecting the space that was now his. The kitchen was cluttered, dishes left out as if someone had been in the middle of a meal when they'd left, though the food had long since rotted away. Upstairs, the bedrooms were untouched, the beds still made as if awaiting their occupants. Yet, everything felt wrong. Not just abandoned, but disturbed, unsettled. A sound came from outside, just the wind, surely, but it made Nathan pause. He moved to the window, looking out over the fields. The wheat stretched out as far as the eye could see, but there, in the distance, something moved. Just for a moment, a flicker of movement between the stalks. He squinted, but it was gone. Shaking off the feeling, he turned back to the house. As he moved through the hallway, a chill ran down his spine. On the floor, near the back door, something caught his eye. A dark stain spread across the wooden planks, dried and crusted. He knelt down to inspect it. Blood, long dried but unmistakable. Suddenly, the silence felt suffocating. The air grew heavier, the walls seemed to close in, and the house that had once stood so still seemed to breathe around him. Nathan stood, his heart beginning to race. Something was wrong here. Something had happened in this place, and it wasn't done yet. Outside, the wind picked up, the wheat fields swaying violently now as the night fully descended. The sense of being watched grew stronger. He could feel it, eyes hidden somewhere in the vastness, watching his every move. The arrival was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Fields. The moon hung high over the fields, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. In the darkness, the vast expanse of wheat appeared like a shifting ocean, its golden stalks swaying in unison. The farmhouse behind Nathan was barely visible now, swallowed by the blackness, as he stood at the edge of the field. There had been no sleep for him that night. After finding the stain in the house, his thoughts had turned restless, tangled with unease. The silence around him pressed in from all sides, thicker than before, almost alive. Something had drawn him outside, a pull that was subtle but irresistible, urging him toward the fields that stretched endlessly before him. The air was still, too still. He stepped into the wheat, pushing aside the tall stalks as he ventured deeper into the heart of the field. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself resisted his movement. The path behind him disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the endless sea of grain. His breath was shallow, and the quiet seemed to amplify the sound of his pulse, drumming in his ears. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the surroundings became. The wheat shifted around him, moving with the breeze, but occasionally there would be a ripple, a strange disturbance, as if something moved through the crops just out of sight. He quickened his pace, though he wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't fear, at least not yet, but there was something about the field, a presence that made him uneasy. The wind picked up, the sound of the wheat brushing against itself like the soft rustle of whispers. Nathan paused, listening. At first, it was just the wind, or so it seemed, but then the whispers grew more distinct, layered beneath the breeze, as though the field itself was speaking. He scanned the horizon. There was nothing to be seen, only the endless field stretching out into the night. Yet the whispers persisted, just out of reach, words forming but never quite clear. They seemed to follow him, circling him in the darkness. A cold sweat broke out on his skin as he tried to shake off the growing sense of paranoia. Then, movement. Not far ahead, the wheat parted as though something was pushing its way through. Nathan's heart raced. His eyes followed the movement, but he saw nothing, only the tall stalks of wheat bending and swaying unnaturally. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching on the dry soil beneath him. Suddenly, the whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. The wind died down, and the field became unnaturally still. Nathan froze, standing motionless as his eyes scanned the shadows ahead. The sense of being watched returned with a vengeance, stronger now, pressing down on him. He looked back, but the farmhouse was nowhere to be seen, lost in the darkness. His path was gone, swallowed by the wheat. Panic flickered at the edge of his thoughts, but he pushed it down. He had to keep moving forward. There was no other choice. He pushed through the wheat, his pace quickening, his breath coming faster. The field around him seemed endless, stretching in every direction. And then, ahead of him, he saw it. A figure. It was distant, barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakable. It stood in the middle of the field, motionless, its form silhouetted against the horizon. Nathan's blood ran cold as he stared at it. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs thin and elongated, like something out of a nightmare. For a moment, neither of them moved. The figure stood still, watching. Nathan couldn't see its face, but he could feel its gaze, heavy, oppressive, as if it was studying him. His pulse quickened, and he took an involuntary step backward. The figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It simply seemed to shift, its form blurring slightly as it glided toward him. Nathan's chest tightened. He turned and ran, pushing through the wheat as fast as he could, his feet slipping on the uneven ground. The whispers returned, louder now, following him as he fled. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The field seemed to close in around him, the stalks of wheat grabbing at his clothes, pulling him back as he stumbled forward. The figure's presence pressed closer, its unseen gaze burning into the back of his neck. Nathan's lungs screamed for air, his legs aching as he ran blindly through the field. Just when he thought he couldn't run anymore, the wheat parted before him, revealing a clearing. He burst through the last of the stalks and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, ancient and weathered. It seemed out of place, as though it had no business being there. but its presence was undeniable. Nathan's eyes locked onto the well, and a deep sense of dread settled over him. The figure was gone. The field was silent, but he wasn't alone. There, near the well, lay a bundle of something, half covered in dirt and grain. Nathan crawled forward, his body weak and trembling. His hands reached out and pulled away the wheat, revealing a tattered piece of cloth. Underneath was a long-forgotten object, an old, weather-beaten journal. His heart pounded as he picked it up, the pages yellowed and brittle, filled with writing in a language he didn't understand. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, swirling in his ears as he flipped through the pages. The well loomed before him, its depths yawning, dark and endless. The arrival was only the beginning. The whispers promised much more. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. Morning broke through the horizon with a muted light, the sky overcast with thick, heavy clouds. Nathan sat by the window in the farmhouse, staring blankly out at the endless expanse of wheat fields. The events of the night weighed heavily on him, but he could barely make sense of it. The well, the figure, the journal. All of it seemed unreal in the harsh light of day, like fragments of a fading nightmare. Yet the dirt under his nails and the journal lying on the table before him told a different story. The journal was ancient, its cover cracked and peeling, the pages yellowed with time. The strange, cryptic symbols that filled its pages were unlike anything Nathan had seen before. He had spent hours poring over it, but no amount of staring had unlocked its meaning. The words seemed to shift on the page, just out of focus, evading comprehension like a half-remembered dream. The more he looked at them, the more they seemed to press down on him, a weight in his mind that he couldn't shake. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rustling the wheat in a steady, rhythmic dance. It had been there, in the field, that the whispers had come to him, and though the day was bright, Nathan couldn't shake the sense that something still lurked beyond the tall stalks. His uncle's farm had always been distant, a vague memory at best, but now, it felt like a place he was never meant to come to, a place with its own dark secrets that had been waiting for him. Determined to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to him, Nathan stood and walked to the barn. The structure loomed large and silent, its weathered boards groaning slightly as the wind gusted. He had been avoiding it since his arrival, but now, something drew him toward it. Perhaps it was the need to feel some sense of control, to face whatever had been haunting him since last night. The barn doors creaked as he pulled them open, revealing the shadowy interior. Dust swirled in the air, catching the thin beams of sunlight that slipped through the gaps in the wood. Old farming equipment, rusted and unused for years, cluttered the space. Tools lay scattered across the floor, and old wooden crates were stacked haphazardly along the walls. The scent of damp earth and decaying wood filled the air. Nathan stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. His eyes scanned the barn, and for a moment, it seemed like any other old, forgotten place. But then, his gaze fell on something in the far corner, something that didn't belong. A large, iron trapdoor, set into the floor. It was ancient, its surface pitted and scarred with rust, and it stood out against the rest of the barn as though it had been added long after the building had been constructed. Nathan's heart quickened as he moved toward it, his breath shallow. The trapdoor was heavy, its iron hinges groaning as he pulled it open. Beneath it, a narrow staircase descended into the earth, leading to darkness. For a long moment, Nathan stood frozen, staring down into the void. The air that wafted up from below was cold, carrying with it a damp, musty odor that chilled him to the bone. He hesitated, every instinct in his body screaming at him to close the door and leave. But something deeper, something darker, urged him forward. He grabbed a flashlight from the wall and stepped onto the first stair. The old wood creaked beneath his weight, but it held. Slowly, he descended, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the thick blackness below. The walls were rough stone, wet with condensation, and the deeper he went, the colder the air became. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the narrow passage, the only sound in the oppressive silence. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a small chamber. Nathan swept the flashlight across the space, his breath catching in his throat. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with strange objects: bottles of dark, viscous liquids, jars containing withered plants, and old, rusted tools that seemed too crude to have any real use. On a wooden table in the center of the room lay several old, leather-bound books, their covers cracked and worn. But it was the far wall that drew his attention. There, carved deep into the stone, was a symbol, intricate and strange, much like the ones in the journal. It was a spiral of sorts, surrounded by jagged lines and angular shapes that seemed to twist in on themselves, warping the space around them. Nathan stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight flickering slightly. He reached out to touch the carving, but the moment his fingers brushed the stone, the light in his hand sputtered and died. Darkness engulfed the room in an instant, thick and suffocating. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the flashlight, but it refused to turn back on. In the pitch black, he could hear it, the whispers again, faint but growing louder, echoing off the walls. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him. His pulse quickened as he stumbled backward, the air around him growing colder with each passing second. His hand grazed the table, knocking over one of the old books, and as it hit the floor, the whispers stopped. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Nathan stood frozen in the dark, his breath shallow, his body tense. After what felt like an eternity, the flashlight flickered back to life. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the chamber once more. But something had changed. The room felt different, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. The carving on the wall seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. Nathan backed away, his mind racing. Whatever this place was, it had been hidden for a reason. He turned and hurried up the stairs, his footsteps loud and hurried in the confined space. Back in the barn, the daylight felt like a lifeline. Nathan slammed the trapdoor shut, his chest heaving. But even as he stood in the safety of the sunlight, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him up from the depths. The shadows of the past had awoken, and they weren't done with him yet. Chapter 4: The Watchers. As the sun climbed to its midday peak, Nathan found himself standing on the edge of the property, staring out into the sprawling fields that stretched toward the distant horizon. The wheat swayed in the wind, golden and innocent under the sun, but his mind was far from at ease. The journal, the trapdoor, the strange carving, pieces of a puzzle he had never intended to solve. Yet, here he was, drawn deeper into whatever strange force was at work. The events of the last few days weighed on him heavily. His hands were raw from gripping the old shovel he carried, his mind foggy with questions that had no answers. The weight of the unknown pressed against his chest as he trudged into the field, the long stalks closing in around him, isolating him from the world behind. He had decided, against all reason, to return to where he had seen the figure last night. He couldn't explain why, only that something in him needed to know more. The air grew thick as he ventured farther from the farmhouse, the wind still carrying a faint whisper as it passed through the wheat. Nathan's steps became slower, more deliberate, as though the ground itself resisted him. His boots crunched through the brittle stalks, each sound magnified in the unnatural stillness of the day. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool breeze, and his grip on the shovel tightened as he pushed forward. Time seemed to lose meaning as he walked, the sun unmoving in the sky, and the field stretching endlessly in every direction. Every step felt like a journey into the unknown, a step closer to whatever had called him here. Then, just ahead, the wheat parted, revealing the clearing, the same one from the night before. The old stone well sat at its center, and beside it, the small mound of earth where the journal had lain. Nathan stopped, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes scanned the clearing. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but something felt different, off, somehow. The silence around him was deafening, as though the field itself was holding its breath, waiting. The clearing seemed to pulse with an energy that he could feel vibrating beneath his feet, faint but unmistakable. He approached the well, each step careful and measured, as though any sudden movement might awaken something slumbering deep beneath the ground. The old stones were weathered and cracked, covered in patches of moss, and the gaping mouth of the well yawned up at him, dark and foreboding. Nathan's eyes lingered on the edge of the well for a long moment before shifting downward. The journal was gone. Where the bundle had been last night, there was nothing but disturbed earth and scattered stalks of wheat. His pulse quickened. He knelt beside the well, inspecting the ground. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been here. Yet, the journal had vanished. The clearing grew darker as clouds gathered overhead, thick and heavy. Nathan's eyes flickered toward the horizon, but there was no sign of rain, only an ominous heaviness that seemed to settle over the land. The wind died completely, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. And then, he felt it, eyes. His body tensed as a chill ran down his spine. The feeling was unmistakable. He was being watched. Slowly, carefully, Nathan straightened, his grip tightening on the shovel as he scanned the field. At first, there was nothing, only the tall stalks of wheat swaying gently in the wind. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw them. Figures. They stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible among the wheat. Tall and gaunt, their forms twisted and unnatural, like shadows that didn't belong. They didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there, watching him with unseen eyes. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, his mind racing. The figures remained motionless, as if rooted to the earth, but their presence was undeniable. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt heavy, frozen in place. He forced himself to breathe, his eyes locked on the figures, waiting for any sign of movement. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, as the watchers stood sentinel at the edge of the field. Nathan's mind raced, trying to piece together what they were, why they were here, but no answers came. Only the weight of their gaze, pressing down on him like a physical force. Slowly, almost mechanically, Nathan took another step back, his body trembling with the effort to move. The figures remained still, their forms swaying gently with the movement of the wheat. They were not human. He knew that much. They were something else, something older, something far beyond his understanding. The clearing felt smaller now, as though the world itself was closing in on him. His eyes darted from figure to figure, his grip on the shovel tightening until his knuckles turned white. He could feel their presence in his bones, in his mind. A weight that pressed down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures began to fade. One by one, they dissolved into the wheat, their forms dissipating like mist in the morning light. The tension in the air lifted slightly, though the oppressive silence remained. Nathan stood frozen, his body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The wind returned, a soft breeze that rustled the wheat and carried the faintest echo of whispers. The figures were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Nathan exhaled slowly, his muscles aching from the strain of standing so rigidly. He backed away from the well, his eyes still scanning the field, expecting the figures to return at any moment. But the field remained empty. He turned and made his way back through the wheat, his pace slow and deliberate. His mind raced with questions, but there were no answers, only the oppressive feeling that had settled over him like a shroud. The watchers were gone, but they had left their mark. He could feel it in his bones, in the air around him. As he neared the farmhouse, Nathan glanced back at the field one last time. The clearing was distant now, barely visible through the tall stalks of wheat, but he could still feel it, like a wound in the earth, festering just beneath the surface. The watchers were gone, but they had seen him, and somehow, he knew they would return. Chapter 5. Echoes Beneath the Soil. The morning arrived, colder than usual, with a pale sun hanging low in the sky. Nathan awoke, his body aching from another restless night, the heaviness of the air outside seeping into his bones. The events in the field played on a loop in his mind. The watchers, their silent presence burned into his thoughts. Every creak of the old house felt like a warning, a reminder that something was terribly wrong. He stood by the window, looking out over the farm, his eyes drawn again to the vast wheat field stretching into the distance. The land seemed to stretch on forever, holding secrets far older than his family's history with it. His father had warned him once, years ago, about digging too deep, metaphorically, of course. But now, the warning felt literal, like an unspoken truth he had ignored for too long. Nathan dressed quickly, his movements mechanical, as though some unseen force was driving him forward. He grabbed a bag of supplies, an old lantern, rope, and the notebook he had kept since finding the trapdoor. His heart pounded as he opened the door, stepping out into the cold morning air. The farmhouse stood silent behind him as he made his way down the dirt path toward the field. There was no wind today. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the very earth beneath him had drawn in a breath and held it. He pushed through the field, the wheat brushing against his legs, and felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. It was different now. The earth beneath his feet felt alive, humming with a barely perceptible energy. The path to the clearing felt longer today, like the land was stretching itself, trying to dissuade him from returning. He moved slower, his senses alert to every slight change in the air, the shadows flickering in the corners of his vision. The well was there, waiting for him, its weathered stones radiating the same cold emptiness he had felt the first time. But today, he wasn't here for the well. Nathan knelt beside the mound of earth where the journal had been. The earth had been disturbed, just as before, but today it felt like more than just a missing book. It felt like something was moving beneath the soil, something shifting and unsettled. He placed his hand on the ground, feeling for vibrations, for any hint of what lay beneath. The pulse of the earth was faint but unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to mirror his own heart. He began digging, not with the frantic energy he'd used before, but with a methodical purpose. Every scoop of dirt was careful, calculated. The earth here was softer, more pliant than he remembered. Each shovelful came easier than the last, as though the ground wanted to be opened, to reveal what lay hidden below. After several minutes, his shovel hit something solid. Nathan paused, his breath caught in his throat. He knelt down, brushing the dirt away with his hands, revealing an old wooden door. The trapdoor from the farmhouse. How had it moved here? His hands trembled as he pried the door open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel descending into the earth. A ladder, ancient and rotting, led down into the blackness below. Nathan hesitated, the oppressive silence pressing in on him from all sides. The air around the opening felt colder, as though the tunnel exhaled its own breath, stale and heavy. But he had come this far. There was no turning back now. He descended slowly, his hands gripping the rungs of the ladder tightly, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The darkness swallowed him whole, and for a moment, he felt completely alone, suspended between the world above and whatever waited for him below. The light from his lantern flickered weakly, barely cutting through the thick shadows that clung to the walls of the tunnel. The air grew damp as he descended further, the walls narrowing around him. He reached the bottom, his boots sinking slightly into the moist earth. The tunnel stretched out before him, a narrow, winding path leading deeper into the unknown. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols carved into the stone, symbols he recognized from the journal. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and Nathan felt a chill run down his spine as he stepped forward. The tunnel was low, forcing him to stoop as he moved, his lantern casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every sound was amplified in the silence. The crunch of his boots on the dirt, the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of his own breath. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The further he went, the more the walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each step. His mind raced with questions. How had this tunnel existed beneath the farm for so long without anyone knowing? What were the symbols, and who had carved them? And then, he heard it. Faint, at first, like the echo of a distant heartbeat. A rhythmic thumping, steady and slow, pulsing through the walls of the tunnel. It was coming from up ahead, growing louder as he moved deeper into the earth. His heart pounded in his chest, matching the rhythm of the sound. It felt familiar, almost comforting, despite the oppressive weight of the tunnel around him. The walls were wet now, slick with moisture, and the air smelled of rot. Nathan's lantern flickered again, the light growing weaker as the sound grew louder. His steps quickened, driven by a force he didn't understand, but couldn't resist. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness, the walls covered in the same strange carvings. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the source of the sound. A massive stone slab lay on the ground, ancient and worn, covered in a thick layer of moss and dirt. The rhythmic thumping echoed from beneath it, vibrating through the floor, through Nathan's body. He stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand as he stared at the slab, his mind reeling with the impossible reality of it. The slab pulsed with life, as though something beneath it was trying to escape, trying to break free from its ancient prison. Nathan's body trembled as he approached, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave the chamber and never return. But his feet moved on their own, drawn toward the slab, toward the sound. He knelt beside it, his hands hovering over the stone, the cold radiating up through his fingers. The sound was deafening now, the rhythmic thumping filling his head, drowning out all other thoughts. He could feel it in his bones, in his mind. A presence, something vast and ancient, waiting just beneath the surface. Nathan's hands pressed against the stone, and the ground beneath him trembled. The slab shifted. With a deafening crack, the stone split down the middle, and the chamber plunged into darkness. Chapter 6. The Sleepless Night. The night wrapped itself around the farmhouse like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its stillness. Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes fixed on the single, flickering candle that cast a dim glow across the room. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, the moon hidden behind thick clouds that threatened a storm. It had been days since the events at the tunnel, since the stone slab had shifted and the strange energy had escaped into the air, but Nathan could still feel it. The weight of something unseen, lingering just beneath the surface of reality. Sleep had evaded him ever since. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind would return to the chamber, to the pulsing heartbeat of the earth, to the tremor that had cracked the stone and released whatever had been imprisoned below. And though nothing had physically changed since that night, no strange visitors, no monstrous apparitions, he knew that something was watching him. Something was waiting. The candle flickered again, its light trembling as if in response to an invisible breath. Nathan felt a shiver crawl down his spine, but he refused to acknowledge the fear that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He was safe here, in his home. The farmhouse had been in his family for generations, built by his ancestors to withstand anything the land could throw at them. Yet, despite its solid walls and familiar creaks, the house felt different now. It felt alive. The room was filled with the soft sounds of the night, the distant rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional groan of wood as the house settled. But underneath it all, there was a faint hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very foundation of the building. It was the same rhythm he had heard in the chamber, the same pulse that had echoed through the tunnel. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, constant and unyielding. Nathan stood and crossed the room to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. The field stretched out before him, bathed in the pale light of the candle. The wheat swayed gently in the breeze, but beyond that, everything was still. The sky was black, the stars hidden behind the approaching storm. He searched the darkness for any sign of movement, any hint of the presence that haunted him, but there was nothing, just the empty fields and the oppressive silence. He turned away from the window and returned to his bed, but he couldn't bring himself to lie down. Sleep seemed impossible now, with the weight of the night pressing in on him from all sides. Instead, he reached for the notebook on his bedside table, flipping it open to the first page. His own handwriting stared back at him, a record of everything he had uncovered so far. The symbols, the tunnel, the stone slab. But there were no answers here, no explanation for what he had found. His fingers traced the lines of the strange symbols he had copied from the chamber walls, their shapes twisting and curling in ways that defied logic. They seemed to move on the page, as though alive with some ancient energy. Nathan had spent hours trying to decipher them, but their meaning eluded him. He had tried searching through old texts, reaching out to historians, but nothing came close to explaining what these markings were, or where they came from. The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, and Nathan felt his heartbeat quicken in response. It was as if the very air around him was vibrating, filled with the same energy that had surged through the earth beneath the stone slab. He could feel it in his bones, in his chest, a deep, primal force that demanded to be acknowledged. Unable to ignore it any longer, Nathan stood and grabbed the lantern from his bedside table. He lit it with a shaking hand, the flame flickering to life and casting a warm glow across the room. Without thinking, he left the room, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor as he moved through the darkened hallway. The house felt different at night. The walls seemed to close in, the familiar creaks and groans of the old wood taking on a sinister edge. Shadows twisted in the corners of his vision, shapes shifting and disappearing before he could fully comprehend them. He descended the stairs slowly, his grip tight on the lantern's handle as the light flickered with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused. The hum was stronger here, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. It was coming from below, from the very earth itself. Nathan knew what he had to do, but his body rebelled against the thought. The trapdoor in the kitchen. He hadn't opened it since that night, hadn't dared to look at what might lie beneath. But now, it was calling to him. The same pulse that had drawn him to the stone slab. With a deep breath, he crossed the room to the kitchen, the lantern casting long shadows across the floor. The trapdoor was exactly where it had always been, its worn wood blending into the floorboards around it. But now, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though something was waiting just below, hidden in the darkness. Nathan set the lantern on the floor and knelt beside the trapdoor, his hands trembling as he grasped the iron ring. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on him, before pulling the door open with a creak. The smell hit him first, a damp, earthy scent that filled his lungs and made his skin crawl. The air that rose from the cellar was thick, almost suffocating, and the hum that had filled the house now roared in his ears, louder than ever. He shone the lantern down into the cellar, its weak light barely penetrating the darkness below. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. But tonight, they seemed unfamiliar, as though they led somewhere else entirely. Nathan descended slowly, his feet moving of their own accord, driven by the same force that had brought him here. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the cellar, the walls damp with moisture. The hum vibrated through the walls, through his bones, until it felt as though his entire body was resonating with the strange energy. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar opened up into a small, cramped room. The stone walls were lined with shelves filled with old jars and bottles, their contents long since spoiled. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay hanging heavy in the air. But in the center of the room, something new had appeared. A circle had been etched into the floor, its lines glowing faintly in the dim light of the lantern. The symbols were the same as those in the tunnel, their twisting shapes pulsating with the same energy that filled the air. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, the light from the lantern flickering as if in response to the power emanating from the circle. He knelt beside it, his hand hovering over the lines. The hum was deafening now, filling his head, his thoughts. The air around him felt alive, vibrating with a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating. And as he touched the edge of the circle, the ground beneath him shifted, the stones trembling with the weight of something ancient and unseen. The cellar door slammed shut above him, plunging the room into darkness. Chapter 7. The Scent of Decay. The morning came, but it brought no warmth. Outside, the wind howled through the barren fields, whipping the dead stalks of wheat into a frantic dance. The sky hung low, gray and swollen with the promise of rain, casting the world in a muted light. The air smelled of earth, damp and heavy, but beneath it, there was something else, something rotten. Inside the farmhouse, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, unmoving. His eyes were glazed, staring blankly at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, the steam long since evaporated. He hadn't slept, He hadn't left the cellar until the first light of dawn had crept through the cracks in the trapdoor. Even now, as he sat in the cold, quiet kitchen, the events of the night before clung to him like a second skin. The cellar, the circle, the hum. Nathan's mind was a fog of fractured images and sensations, flashes of light, the thrum of energy beneath the earth, the sound of the trapdoor slamming shut. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite grasp. A shadow, a presence that had been with him in the dark, watching, waiting. The hum had stopped when he left the cellar, but its absence was almost worse. The silence that now filled the house was oppressive, thick with unspoken tension. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air stagnant and stifling. And then there was the smell, faint but unmistakable, the scent of decay. At first, Nathan had dismissed it, thinking it was just the lingering dampness from the cellar. But as the hours passed, the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It was an acrid, metallic odor that filled his nostrils and settled in the back of his throat, clinging to the air like a sickly perfume. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. The smell was everywhere now, seeping into the walls, the floors, the very fabric of the house. He needed to find the source. There had to be something, an animal that had crawled into the walls and died, or perhaps a rotten beam in the cellar that had finally given way. Nathan moved through the house with slow, deliberate steps, his bare feet making soft sounds against the wooden floorboards. The smell intensified as he reached the hallway, a thick, cloying stench that seemed to emanate from every corner. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The air was colder here, the smell stronger. Without thinking, Nathan ascended the stairs, each step a little heavier than the last. The narrow hallway at the top of the stairs stretched before him, dimly lit by the pale morning light filtering through the window at the far end. The door to his bedroom was slightly ajar, and as he approached, the smell hit him like a wave, thick, rancid, suffocating. He pushed the door open slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was exactly as he had left it the night before. The bed was unmade, the candle still sitting on the nightstand, its wick burned down to a nub, but the smell was overwhelming now, filling the room like a living thing. Nathan's eyes scanned the room, searching for the source. It didn't take long. In the far corner of the room, just beneath the window, the floorboards were blackened and warped, as if something had seeped up from below. The wood was cracked and splintered, the edges curling like the petals of a dead flower. Nathan approached cautiously, his breath shallow as the smell grew stronger, more concentrated. He knelt beside the damaged floorboards, his fingers tracing the edges of the blackened wood. The smell was unbearable here, so strong that it brought tears to his eyes. He could see something dark and viscous pooled in the cracks between the boards, a thick, oily substance that glistened in the faint light. Nathan's stomach churned, but he couldn't look away. His fingers hovered over the liquid, hesitating for a moment before he dipped them into the black substance. It was cold and slick, clinging to his skin like tar. He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping the liquid on the floor, but the smell only intensified, filling his lungs with the stench of rot. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no leak in the roof, no broken pipes that could explain the damage to the floorboards. The substance, whatever it was coming from below, from the earth itself. Nathan stood abruptly, backing away from the corner as a chill ran down his spine. The air in the room was thick with the smell now, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on him like a weight. His head throbbed, and his vision swam as he stumbled toward the door. He needed to get out of the house. He moved quickly, descending the stairs two at a time, the smell following him like a shadow. In the kitchen, he grabbed his coat and keys, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the latch on the front door. The cold air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, the wind biting at his skin. But the smell was still there, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his very breath. Nathan crossed the yard quickly, heading toward the barn at the edge of the property. The wind howled through the fields, carrying the scent of decay with it, as if the very land had been tainted. He reached the barn and threw open the door. stepping inside and slamming it shut behind him. The barn was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of old hay and dust. But it was a relief compared to the stench inside the house. Nathan leaned against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His hands trembled, and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The black substance, the smell, the damaged floorboards. It didn't make any sense. He had to go back. He had to figure out what was happening. But not yet. Not now. The smell was too strong. The memories of the cellar too fresh. He needed time to think, to plan. Nathan stood in the darkness of the barn, the wind howling outside, the smell of decay lingering in the air. Whatever had been buried beneath the earth was coming closer, and he knew that it wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. For now, all he could do was wait. Wait, and hope that the smell wouldn't follow him here. Chapter 8. Through the Earth. The morning had passed in uneasy silence, with Nathan sitting on the wooden bench outside the barn, staring at the horizon. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the pale sky, its windows empty and lifeless. The smell of decay that had haunted him all night seemed to linger in the air. Even out here, the cold wind carried it like a ghost, wrapping it around him no matter how far he tried to run. But Nathan knew he couldn't run from it. It was not just the house. It was something far deeper, something in the ground, beneath his feet, in the soil itself. He could feel it now, as if the earth was breathing, exhaling that foul stench with every gust of wind. The land around him, once lush and fertile, had taken on a sickly hue, the grass turning brown at the edges, the trees losing their leaves too early in the season. The crops in the nearby field, which had been his lifeline, were dying, stalks of wheat bending under the weight of rot. Nathan stood and began to walk through the fields. His boots sank slightly into the wet, muddy ground with each step, the earth soft and yielding beneath him. The wind was colder here, sharper, biting at his skin. As he walked, the stench grew stronger again, curling up from the ground like an invisible fog, swirling around his legs and crawling up his spine. He followed it, instinctively, his feet guiding him toward the source. At the far end of the field, near the boundary where his land met the forest, there was a large patch of earth that had always been a little different. The grass there had never grown as thick, and in the summer, the soil had always been dry and cracked, despite the surrounding areas flourishing. But now, that patch was darker, almost black, like a stain against the rest of the field. Nathan approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The smell was overpowering now, thick and nauseating, making his head swim. As he neared the patch of blackened earth, he could see it more clearly. The soil was cracked and broken, as if something had forced its way up from below, pushing the ground apart. He knelt down, running his fingers over the cracks. The earth felt damp, cold, and as his fingers sank into the soil, they came away coated in a dark, oily substance. It was the same black liquid he had found in the house, beneath the floorboards. Nathan's stomach churned. He wiped his hand on his coat, but the substance clung to his skin, leaving behind a foul, greasy residue. He backed away, but something caught his eye, movement, just beneath the surface of the soil. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the ground. The earth seemed to pulse, as if something was alive beneath it. Slowly, deliberately, the blackened soil shifted, rising in places, sinking in others, as though it were breathing. He took another step back, his mind racing. He had never believed in superstitions or old stories about cursed land. But this was something else, something unnatural, something that defied explanation. The earth shifted again, and this time, a small crack appeared in the center of the blackened patch. Nathan watched in horrified fascination as the crack widened, spreading outward like a spider's web. The ground seemed to buckle and fold, the black liquid bubbling up from beneath, spilling out over the cracked soil. And then, from the depths of the earth, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, an indistinct shape rising from the dark, oily pool. But as it climbed higher, Nathan could see it more clearly. It was twisted and grotesque, a mass of roots and vines, tangled together in a nightmarish form. The black liquid clung to it, dripping from its gnarled limbs, as it slowly pulled itself up from the ground. Nathan stumbled backward, his heart racing in his chest. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to move with purpose, each root and vine writhing and twisting as it emerged from the earth. It stood tall now, towering over him, its form shifting and changing with every second, as though it were struggling to maintain a shape. The smell was unbearable now, thick and cloying, filling the air with the stench of death and decay. Nathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no logic to it, no explanation, only the raw, primal terror of the unknown. The creature, if it could even be called that, moved slowly toward him, its massive roots and vines stretching out, reaching for him. Nathan turned and ran, his boots sinking into the muddy ground as he fled across the field. The wind howled in his ears, and the smell followed him, clinging to him like a curse. He reached the edge of the forest, ducking beneath the low-hanging branches of the trees. The air here was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but even that was tainted by the stench of the creature. He could hear it behind him, the sound of roots tearing through the soil, the earth groaning beneath its weight. Nathan didn't stop. He ran deeper into the forest, his lungs burning, his legs heavy. The trees closed in around him, the underbrush scraping against his skin, but he didn't care. All he could think about was getting away. Away from the blackened earth, away from the thing that had risen from the ground. But the smell, oh, the smell, it was everywhere now. It filled his lungs, choking him, making his head spin. His vision blurred as he stumbled through the forest, the world tilting and swaying around him. The trees seemed to warp and twist, their branches curling like fingers, reaching for him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chase was over. Nathan collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. The forest was silent now, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. He lay there for what felt like hours, his mind racing, his body too weak to move. When he finally gathered the strength to stand, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Nathan turned back toward the field, his heart heavy with dread. He could still smell it, the stench of decay, but it was fainter now, more distant. The creature was gone, but the blackened earth remained, and Nathan knew that whatever had been buried beneath it was not finished. Not yet. Chapter 9. The Hollow Echo. The rain had started sometime in the early morning, long before dawn, and had continued without pause. The sound of it on the roof was relentless, a constant hammering that filled the house with its dull, droning rhythm. The windows, streaked with rain, were blurred, making the world outside seem distant and unreal, as though Nathan was trapped in a cage of glass and water. He sat at the kitchen table, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. His eyes, red and tired, were fixed on the window, watching the endless sheet of rain slide down the glass. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the weak light of the stormy sky. Everything felt muted, as if the world had slipped into a gray haze, a state of limbo between waking and sleeping. The farmhouse felt heavier today, as though the rain had soaked into the very walls, weighing them down. The air inside was damp and cold, with a faint smell of mildew creeping in from the corners. It had been weeks since the thing in the field had emerged, and Nathan had retreated into the house, barely venturing outside, afraid of what might still linger beneath the surface of the land. He hadn't been sleeping. Every night, he lay in bed, his mind racing, eyes fixed on the ceiling as he listened to the sounds of the house settling around him. The creaks, the groans, the occasional scrape of something outside. He could feel it in his bones, the presence, the waiting. He had not seen it since that night, but he knew it was still out there, hiding just beneath the surface, biding its time. Nathan ran his hand over the rough surface of the table, feeling the ridges and grooves beneath his fingertips. His hands were calloused from years of work on the farm, but they trembled slightly now, betraying the fear that had rooted itself deep inside him. He looked down at them, at the way they shook, and clenched them into fists. The rain was louder now, pounding harder against the roof. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, rolling growl that vibrated through the house. Nathan shifted in his seat, unease prickling at the back of his neck. There was something different about the storm today, something unnatural in the way the rain fell and the sky darkened, as though the world itself was turning against him. He stood up from the table, his legs stiff from sitting too long. The kitchen seemed even darker now, the shadows stretching along the walls as the light outside grew dimmer. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of rain and earth. Nathan moved toward the window, staring out into the yard. The ground was a sea of mud, the grass slick and brown, bending under the weight of the water. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches thrashing like wild animals. And then, for the briefest of moments, the rain stopped. It was as if the world had drawn in a breath and held it. The sound of the storm vanished, leaving behind a deafening silence. Nathan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared out at the yard, his eyes wide, searching for something, anything that could explain the sudden, eerie stillness. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the stillness of the rain-soaked land and the oppressive silence that wrapped around him like a shroud. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the rain began again, harder than before. But this time, something was different. Beneath the roar of the rain, there was another sound. A low, hollow echo, barely audible, but there. Nathan pressed his ear against the window, straining to hear over the pounding of the storm. The sound was coming from beneath the ground, a deep, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. His pulse quickened. He had heard this sound before. On the night when the thing had emerged from the field, he had felt it beneath his feet, the steady, rhythmic pulse of something ancient and alive. But now, it was louder, closer, as if the earth was ready to crack open once more. Without thinking, Nathan turned away from the window and rushed toward the door. He threw it open, stepping out into the storm. The rain lashed against his skin, soaking him instantly, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the ground, on the patch of blackened earth at the far end of the field. The thumping grew louder as he approached, vibrating through the ground and up into his bones. His feet sank into the mud with every step, the cold water splashing against his legs. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches clawing at the sky, but Nathan didn't stop. He couldn't. When he reached the blackened patch, the sound was deafening. The ground beneath him was shaking now, as if something was struggling to break free. The cracks in the soil had widened, the black liquid bubbling up from below, spilling out in thick, viscous streams. And then, with a violent shudder, the ground split open. Nathan stumbled back, his heart racing as the earth tore itself apart in front of him. The black liquid gushed out, filling the air with its foul, metallic stench. From the depths of the gaping hole, a massive shape began to rise, its form shrouded in darkness. But this time, it wasn't a tangle of roots and vines. It was something larger, something more defined. The shape moved with purpose, rising slowly from the depths, its surface glistening with the black liquid. Nathan could barely make out its form in the dim light of the storm, but he could feel its presence, massive, powerful, ancient. The rain fell harder, the wind howled, and the ground shook beneath him. Nathan stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror as the thing rose higher and higher, its massive form looming over him like a shadow of death. And then, with one final, violent tremor, it emerged fully from the earth. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The storm raged around them, the rain falling in sheets, the wind howling like a banshee. But Nathan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He could only stare in horror at the thing that had crawled out from the depths of the earth. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its surface was smooth, almost glass-like, reflecting the stormy sky above. But beneath the surface, something moved, shifting and writhing, as though the thing was alive with millions of tiny, wriggling creatures. The ground trembled beneath Nathan's feet, and he stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He had no idea what he was looking at, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was not of this world, and it was awake. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Chamber. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a silence that felt almost oppressive in its emptiness. The sky was a dull gray, with the occasional sliver of weak sunlight struggling to break through the lingering clouds. Nathan remained in the field for hours, unable to tear his eyes away from the massive, otherworldly shape that now lay in the gaping hole. Its presence seemed to warp the air around it, the black liquid pooling and shimmering beneath the dim light. After what felt like an eternity, Nathan forced himself to move. He knew he couldn't stay there forever, and if he was to survive, he needed to find out what had happened. He stumbled back to the farmhouse, his body cold and drenched, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The storm had left a layer of mud and debris across the floors, and the furniture was smeared with dark streaks of water and dirt. The once familiar surroundings now felt alien, as though the house itself had shifted during the storm. Nathan moved through the rooms, his steps heavy and deliberate. The house had been his sanctuary, but now it seemed like a prison. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a threat. He made his way to the basement, a place he had rarely ventured into. It had always been cluttered with old tools, forgotten furniture, and boxes of memories from another time. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the darkness. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air damp and musty. Nathan flicked on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and revealing the cluttered space. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for anything unusual. In one corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates, he noticed something that had always been there but had never really registered. An old, iron door. It was small and unassuming, barely noticeable among the debris. The door was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, its surface marred by scratches and rust. Nathan approached the door, his flashlight illuminating the intricate carvings etched into its surface. The symbols were unfamiliar to him, strange and ancient, and they seemed to pulse with a dark energy. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and a shiver ran down his spine. He pulled at the door, but it didn't budge. The hinges were stiff with age, and the metal felt cold and unyielding. Determined, Nathan grabbed a crowbar from a nearby shelf and wedged it into the crack between the door and the frame. With a grunt of effort, he pried the door open, the rusty hinges screeching in protest. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. The air was thick and stale, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. Nathan hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. But he knew he had to see what lay beyond. He took a deep breath and stepped into the passageway, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The passage was narrow and low, forcing him to duck as he moved. The walls were lined with the same strange symbols as the door, their meanings lost to time but their presence ominous and unsettling. The passage twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger. Nathan's footsteps echoed in the narrow space, each sound amplified by the confined quarters. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small chamber. Nathan stepped into the room, his flashlight revealing its contents. The chamber was bare, its walls lined with the same symbols that had appeared on the door and passageway. In the center of the room stood an old stone altar, its surface covered in grime and dust. The altar was adorned with strange carvings, intricate and detailed, and in the center was a small, shallow basin. The basin was filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to ripple and pulse as if it were alive. The sight of it made Nathan's stomach churn. He approached the altar cautiously, his eyes fixed on the liquid. The symbols carved into the altar seemed to glow faintly, casting a dim, eerie light that made the liquid shimmer. Nathan reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the basin. He could feel a faint, pulsing heat emanating from it, as if it were a living entity. Without warning, the liquid in the basin began to rise, spilling over the sides and pooling onto the altar. Nathan stepped back, his heart racing as the liquid flowed out of the basin and began to spread across the floor. It moved with an unnatural grace, as though it were guided by some unseen force. The chamber seemed to come alive with the movement of the liquid. The symbols on the walls and altar began to shift and change, their shapes morphing into grotesque and nightmarish forms. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and Nathan could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. The chamber felt as though it were closing in on him, the walls pressing in with an almost physical force. The liquid continued to spread, covering the floor and rising up the walls, its dark surface reflecting the shifting symbols. Nathan's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness. Panic surged through him, and he fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of the liquid as it continued to rise and spread, the sensation of it moving closer, encroaching upon him. In the pitch blackness, Nathan could barely make out the shapes and shadows around him. He could feel the liquid at his feet now, the cold, viscous substance creeping up his legs. Desperation took hold of him, and he scrambled toward the passageway, his hands slipping and sliding on the wet floor. He pushed through the passageway, the darkness closing in around him. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to constrict, making it harder to move. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he stumbled, his flashlight still dead, his way barely visible. Finally, he emerged from the passageway, collapsing onto the basement floor. The room was still dark, but the oppressive feeling had lessened. The liquid had not followed him, and the symbols on the walls seemed to have faded, leaving only the lingering sense of dread. Nathan lay on the floor, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The basement felt different now, as though it had been altered by what he had seen. The iron door stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond seeming to beckon him with a malevolent force. He struggled to his feet, his mind still reeling from the experience. He knew he had to leave the basement, to escape from the sense of doom that had settled over him. But as he made his way up the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the chamber had revealed only a fraction of the horrors that lay hidden beneath the surface. The house was still and quiet as he emerged, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos he had just experienced. Nathan glanced back at the basement door, its ominous presence a reminder of the dark forces that seemed to be closing in on him. He knew that whatever was happening was far from over, and the chamber had only been a glimpse into the darkness that lurked below. With a heavy heart and a mind full of fear, Nathan stepped out into the dim light of the afternoon, ready to face whatever awaited him. Chapter 11. The Whispering Trees. The early morning fog clung to the ground, shrouding the countryside in a ghostly veil. The air was crisp and cold, and the grass was coated with a layer of frost that crunched underfoot. Nathan walked through the fields, his breath visible in the chill. The eerie calm of the landscape contrasted sharply with the chaos he had endured. The trees that lined the edge of the field were tall and gnarled, their bare branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. Their dark silhouettes loomed against the pale sky, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. Nathan had always avoided this part of the property, feeling an instinctive discomfort in the presence of the trees. Now, he found himself drawn to them, as though seeking some form of answers or solace. He stepped onto the narrow path that led into the forest, the earth beneath him damp and soft. The trees seemed to close in around him as he walked, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The fog hung heavily between the trunks, swirling and shifting with every step he took. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. Nathan's footsteps echoed softly, muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves that carpeted the ground. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the path became less distinct. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a nearly impenetrable barrier. Nathan pushed through, his hands brushing against the rough bark as he navigated the dense undergrowth. He came upon a clearing, its size vast and open compared to the surrounding forest. The clearing was encircled by a ring of ancient trees, their trunks thick and twisted. At the center of the clearing stood a stone circle, the stones large and uneven, arranged in a rough, irregular pattern. Nathan approached the stone circle cautiously. The stones were covered in a thick layer of moss, and strange symbols were carved into their surfaces. The symbols were similar to those he had seen in the basement, but their meanings remained unclear. They seemed to glow faintly in the subdued light, casting an eerie luminescence across the clearing. The air in the clearing was still, but a faint sound began to emerge, a low, whispering noise that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Nathan stood still, listening intently. The whispering was rhythmic, almost like a chant, and it seemed to come from all directions, carried on the windless air. He moved closer to the stone circle, his eyes scanning the symbols carved into the stones. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and Nathan could feel the vibrations in his chest. It was as though the forest was alive, the trees themselves murmuring secrets from some forgotten age. Nathan reached out to touch one of the stones, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp surface. The whispering intensified, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo in his mind. He could not make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, urgent, pleading, filled with a sense of despair. The ground beneath him began to tremble, faintly at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Nathan stumbled back, his heart racing. The trees surrounding the clearing seemed to sway and bend, their branches moving in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic motion. The whispering grew louder, merging into a single, haunting melody. Nathan felt as though he were being drawn into the center of the clearing, pulled by an unseen force. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the symbols on the stones began to pulse with an otherworldly light. He backed away from the stone circle, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The ground continued to tremble, and the whispering became a relentless torrent of sound. Nathan turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, his path illuminated by the dim light filtering through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing in with an almost tangible force. The whispering followed him, growing fainter but still persistent. Nathan's breaths came in ragged gasps as he pushed through the dense foliage, his heart pounding with a mix of terror and exhaustion. He emerged from the forest, gasping for breath as he stumbled into the open field. The fog had begun to lift, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. The forest behind him was dark and foreboding, its secrets hidden once more in the depths of the trees. Nathan looked back at the forest, his mind reeling from the experience. The stone circle and the whispering voices had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder of the ancient forces at play. He knew he could not escape the darkness that seemed to follow him, but he also knew that he had to keep moving forward. With a heavy heart and a mind filled with unsettling thoughts, Nathan turned and began to walk back toward the farmhouse. The forest stood silent behind him, its mysteries once again concealed beneath the cloak of fog and shadow. Chapter 12. The Fractured Reflection. The farmhouse stood in stark contrast to the landscape that surrounded it. The once cozy home now felt like an island in a sea of desolation. The recent events had taken their toll on Nathan, and he found himself retreating to the one place that had once offered him a semblance of comfort. The house was dark and cold. The windows shuddered against the encroaching dusk. The air inside was stale, carrying a musty scent that clung to the walls. The furniture was covered with sheets, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards as Nathan moved through the rooms. He made his way to the upstairs bathroom, a place he had not visited in some time. The bathroom was small and functional, with white tiles on the floor and walls. A large, antique mirror hung above the sink, its ornate frame tarnished with age. Nathan turned on the tap, the water sputtering before flowing steadily. He filled the sink with water, the sound of the running water echoing in the quiet room. He gazed into the mirror, his reflection distorted by the ripples in the water. The image in the mirror was unsettling. The reflection of his face seemed to shift and warp, the contours of his features becoming fluid and distorted. The more he stared, the more the reflection seemed to take on a life of its own. It was as though the mirror was showing him not just his image, but something deeper and more sinister. Nathan leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the reflection. The water in the sink began to bubble and churn, and the distorted image in the mirror grew more pronounced. Shadows seemed to dance behind his reflection, their movements erratic and unsettling. The room grew colder, and Nathan's breath formed visible clouds in the air. He could feel a faint vibration in the floor, as though the house itself were resonating with an unseen force. The reflection in the mirror became more fragmented, the image of Nathan's face breaking apart into a series of disjointed shapes. The bubbles in the water grew larger, and the swirling motion seemed to pull at the reflection. Nathan's heart raced as he watched, unable to tear his eyes away from the unsettling sight. The shadows behind his reflection grew darker, their shapes taking on a more menacing appearance. The mirror's surface began to ripple, the image of Nathan's face distorting further. It was as if the mirror were trying to communicate something to him, but the message was lost in the chaos of the shifting reflection. The water in the sink reached the rim, and a few droplets spilled over, dripping onto the floor. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shattered. The glass splintered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a different angle of the room. Nathan stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and fear. The once clear image was now a jigsaw of fragmented reflections, each piece showing a distorted version of the scene. He looked around the bathroom, the shards of glass scattered across the floor like dangerous confetti. The fragments glinted in the dim light, casting eerie reflections on the walls. Nathan felt a sense of dread wash over him, as though the shattered mirror had released something dark and malevolent. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in with an oppressive weight. The reflections in the shards seemed to move, the images shifting and changing as though they were alive. Nathan carefully picked up a shard of glass, examining it closely. The reflection it showed was a twisted, nightmarish version of the bathroom, the shadows and light distorted beyond recognition. He dropped the shard, unable to look at it any longer. The sense of unease grew stronger, the shadows in the room seeming to pulse with a dark energy. He left the bathroom, the shattered mirror and the disturbing reflections still vivid in his mind. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long and dark across the walls. Nathan walked through the house, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, his thoughts consumed by the unsettling events of the evening. He made his way to the bedroom, the only room in the house that felt somewhat familiar. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and disheveled. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The shattered mirror had revealed something he was not prepared to confront, something that seemed to reach beyond the physical realm. The reflections had shown him more than just his own image. They had hinted at a deeper, more disturbing reality that lay hidden beneath the surface. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. Nathan lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The shattered mirror and the fractured reflections had left him with a sense of impending doom, as though something dark and malevolent was closing in on him. As he lay there, the room seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing in on him. Nathan could not shake the feeling that the mirror had shown him a glimpse of something far more sinister than he could comprehend. The shattered pieces of glass seemed to hold a dark secret, one that was now haunting him. The shadows in the room danced and shifted, the play of light and dark creating an unsettling atmosphere. Nathan's mind raced with thoughts of the mirror and the fragments of his own reflection. He felt as though he were caught in a nightmarish reality, where the boundaries between the physical and the supernatural were blurred. As the night wore on, Nathan remained awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The shattered mirror and the fractured reflections had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder of the dark forces that seemed to be closing in on him. The sense of dread that had taken hold of him was inescapable, and he knew that the darkness was far from over. With a heavy heart and a mind filled with fear, Nathan lay in the dim light of the room, waiting for the dawn to break and hoping for a reprieve from the nightmares that haunted him. Chapter 13. The Final Ascent. The sun rose with a muted, hazy light, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. The farmhouse, now a somber silhouette against the morning sky, seemed almost at peace with itself, despite the turmoil that had unfolded within its walls. Nathan awoke early, feeling the weight of the previous nights pressing heavily upon him. He gathered a few belongings and left the house, the cool morning air greeting him with a crispness that contrasted sharply with the oppressive atmosphere inside. The field stretched out before him, the frost-covered grass glistening in the early light. He began walking toward the distant hills, his steps purposeful but heavy, as though the weight of his experiences was anchoring him to the ground. The path to the hills was uneven and overgrown, a stark contrast to the well-maintained fields around the farmhouse. Nathan navigated the rugged terrain, pushing through dense underbrush and climbing over fallen branches. His progress was slow, but he pressed on, driven by an unseen force that urged him toward the summit. As he climbed higher, the view became more expansive. The farmhouse grew smaller, its details obscured by the distance. The hills seemed to rise endlessly, their slopes shrouded in mist. The higher Nathan ascended, the more the sense of isolation deepened. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The climb was arduous. The terrain grew steeper, and Nathan found himself gripping onto rocks and roots for support. The mist thickened as he neared the summit, swirling around him and reducing visibility. The chill in the air grew more pronounced, and he could see his breath forming clouds in front of him. At last, he reached the top of the hill. The summit was a small, flat area, covered in a layer of moss and lichen. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered stone pillar, partially covered in moss and engraved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. Nathan approached the stone pillar, his movements slow and deliberate. The symbols on the pillar were similar to those he had seen in the basement and the stone circle, but they were more elaborate and seemed to radiate a palpable energy. The pillar stood solitary and imposing, its presence both ancient and powerful. He circled the pillar, studying the symbols etched into its surface. The mist around him seemed to thicken, swirling in patterns that matched the symbols on the stone. The air grew colder, and Nathan could feel a faint vibration beneath his feet, as though the ground itself were resonating with the energy of the pillar. Nathan placed his hands on the stone, feeling its cold surface against his skin. The vibration grew stronger, and the symbols on the pillar began to glow with a soft, pulsating light. The mist around him seemed to part, revealing glimpses of the landscape below, but the view was distorted, as though seen through a veil of water. As he touched the stone, images began to form in the mist, vivid and fragmented scenes that played out like a series of disjointed memories. Nathan saw fleeting glimpses of events and people, some familiar, some strange and unrecognizable. The images were chaotic and disorienting, their meanings elusive and inscrutable. The pillar's light grew brighter, casting long shadows across the clearing. The mist swirled and danced, forming shapes and patterns that seemed to reach out toward Nathan. The symbols on the stone became more intricate, their light growing more intense with each passing moment. Nathan stepped back, overwhelmed by the intensity of the vision. The images in the mist grew more frenetic, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo through his bones. The sense of isolation and foreboding was palpable, as though the stone pillar was a gateway to a realm beyond comprehension. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The mist around the pillar began to dissipate, the images fading into obscurity. The light from the pillar grew dimmer, and the air returned to its earlier stillness. Nathan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as though the intensity of the experience had somehow cleared the air. Nathan turned and began his descent from the hill, his steps more measured and deliberate. The climb had been physically and emotionally draining, but the experience at the summit had provided him with a strange sense of resolution. The symbols on the pillar and the visions in the mist had left him with a deeper understanding of the forces at play, even if the exact nature of those forces remained elusive. As he descended, the mist receded, revealing the familiar landscape of fields and hills. The farmhouse came back into view, its presence a stark contrast to the ancient power of the stone pillar. Nathan's mind was filled with a mixture of relief and unease, his thoughts reflecting on the events that had transpired and the mysteries that remained. He returned to the farmhouse, the sun now high in the sky. The house stood as a silent witness to the trials he had faced, its interior unchanged since his departure. Nathan entered, feeling a sense of quiet resignation. The house was still and silent, the oppressive atmosphere of the past days seeming to have lifted, if only slightly. Nathan settled into a chair, his thoughts drifting as he looked out the window at the landscape beyond. The fields and hills were bathed in sunlight, the earlier sense of dread replaced by a tentative sense of peace. The journey had come full circle, and though the darkness still lingered in the corners of his mind, there was a sense of closure in the ascent he had made. As the day drew to a close, Nathan felt a deep weariness settle over him. He knew that the shadows of the past would not easily fade, but for now, he could find solace in the knowledge that he had confronted the forces that had haunted him. The stone pillar on the hill stood as a testament to the trials he had faced, a reminder of the ancient and powerful forces that lay beyond human understanding. With a heavy heart and a mind weary from the journey, Nathan prepared for the night. The house, now a sanctuary from the outside world, offered a semblance of refuge. As he lay down, the shadows in the room seemed less menacing, and the darkness outside was tempered by the light of the setting sun. The final ascent had brought him not just to the summit of a hill, but to a deeper understanding of the forces that had shaped his experiences. The journey was not over, but for now, there was a fragile sense of peace, a moment of respite in the midst of the darkness.